It's wonderful to see you from afar. The chair of our executive board, DDG UNESCO, honorable ministers, the president of the General Conference, and of course, dear friends, particularly the young people who have inspired us through this last few days. We've reached the end of a seismic week for transforming education. There's been so much energy, so much discourse and debate, many ideas with the education community, particularly education ministers, out in force in a way we have not seen for years. We were joined in person by over 1,850 people. Many more came online, joined by 2 heads of state, very grateful to them, 154 ministers and deputy ministers of education who brought a crucial national perspective to transformation in the public sector. We were joined by 200 young people whose presence was felt throughout. But Doris, let me say, it wasn't just the dancing, it was your voices and how you were shaping the debate in many of our rooms. We were also joined by many actors that make up our dynamic and diverse global education family. And I have to say, I really, really wished I could have been right there with you, but like thousands of others who joined online, I did feel the beat and very much part of the discussion. So a big thank you for all those who came together. I'm going to crave your indulgence because I got a lot to say. And since I wasn't in the room, please bear with me because this is a outcome and a bridge to New York for which many people have informed. I'd like to give a really big thank you to Director General Azoulay and to Assistant Director General Stefania, the Summit Secretariat, and everyone across the UNESCO who really put their shoulder to the wheel in the past few months and did an amazing job. But I'd also like to thank the member states, our President of the General Conference, our Chair of the Executive Board who's on the stage with you, but also the many permanent representatives behind the scene in New York and in Paris, who really spent a lot of time coming to terms with transformation, because that's a big word in education. And it doesn't just need governments at national level, it needs every player who has been working hard at education over the last few decades. I'd like to give thanks to Minister Senge and our Special Envoy Garnier, who've had to, as we say, herd us all together with a sense of ambition. The fact that we're coming together in this way in a difficult time in our world is an important outcome in of itself, something I'll come back to shortly. Over the last 3 days, we've held hugely insightful sessions on what and how to transform education. We had a youth forum that we must show how now build on by putting youth in the heart of the summit in September in a truly meaningful way. We were reminded by Sophia that youth really have not been in the national consultations, and that's a really serious thing to have to find out at this stage. And so I hope that we continue those consultations, and certainly we will charge the UN system at country level to make sure there is no convening without them. So we're not yet there on the national consultations. But you know, I also saw Doris speaking truth to power. I'm smiling because, you know, yes, you were not in some of the rooms, but goodness me, at your age, I didn't wait to be asked. I just went in, and I can tell you 30 years ago, I walked into many UNESCO rooms in that basement. I was hoping I wouldn't be here 30 years later, but here I am. It is really important that you make yourself not just heard, but felt. You ought to be in a room, there's a spare seat, grab it, occupy it, and be there shaping the agenda. But let me just say, there were some rooms that you were in. The advisory committee had an incredibly strong voice from the youth student movement. And we have seen more young voices come into those rooms. And so our commitment to you is to get many more into the rooms as we can when we go to when we get to September. But before then, there's a couple more dialogues and roundtables. We had amazing side meetings on mobilizing commitment in some critical pieces. We saw meetings of the high-level steering committee on SDG 4, the International Commission on the Futures of Education, and the Summit Advisory Committee, all critical to this process. So where does this leave us as we look to maximize the impact in September? A few hours ago, I discussed this with Minister Senge, our envoy Leonardo, Stefania, and members of the Summit Advisory Committee. Overall, there was a sense that we now have a very real momentum and that we have the basis for concrete outcomes in September and beyond. But there are some tensions, healthy ones, constructive ones, and there's still a considerable amount of work to be done. So let me try to speak through 4 of our main takeaways, and they're not exclusive to the others that I know many have in the room. First, are moving towards a common vision for education transformation. I think we know now what transformation is not about. It's not about filling gaps. It's not about tweaking. It's not about just youth voice and dance. It's not about selecting 1 or 2 big issues. It's not even about more of the same that is even better and faster. And we know to a large extent what it is about. The report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education does provide us with a critical point of departure in this regard. And I'd like to pay tribute to President Saleh Work-Zewde and her fellow commissioners for their outstanding work and continued commitment. And there were many UNESCO experts behind this who also helped to ensure it was articulated in a way in which we were able to harvest the key elements that we have been building upon in this last few days. So transformation is about us repurposing education and rethinking, imagining the what and the how of learning. It's about adopting new policies, practices, approaches, governance systems to ensure that education equips every learner with the skills, knowledge, and value that will allow them to survive and thrive. And I heard this afternoon from the private sector when they said, you know, we can use AI to help the individual learner, that they don't have to wait for a teacher who has a class that's so overcrowded, who never gets to them, to help them realize their potentials. In doing this, each in our own context, supported by the international community and contributing to a better future for all. It brings me to the first tension that was evident this week between the immediate and the long term, between recovery and transformation. And this is understandable. There are enormous needs and resources, and all of them are scarce and often competing. But we must recognize that building back to the same as before the pandemic is not going to get us to the 2030 goals, talk less of transformation. So we need to prioritize recovery and accelerate implementation of the education targets. Yes, but we need to do it in a way that embraces innovation, allows countries to leapfrog in their development, and lays foundations for transformation up to 2030 and way beyond. And how are we going to do that? Leveraging in particular the work of the action tracks, we are beginning to see the emergence of some common elements for transforming the what and how of learning. In terms of the learning environment, the focus of Action Track 1, I believe we have agreement on some fundamentals. We need to transform all learning environments, be they virtual or physical, and their place in society to cater to intrinsic value and well-being of every learner, their nutrition, their mental health, their safety, and we need to do it with a lifelong learning perspective. We need to ensure that the learning environment provides all learners in all contexts with access to education that sets them up to thrive in life. And here we need a laser-sharp focus on those who are excluded again and again from education. Persons with disabilities, children in rural areas, those from poorer backgrounds, displaced persons, and many more, all often intersecting. And let me address one underlying issue here. The single greatest action we can take to ensure the safety of learners and access to learning for all is to end the wars, the political violence, the terrorism, and the systemic discrimination across the world. That goes in particular for the war in Ukraine, which is inflicting a terrible toll on Ukrainian lives, livelihoods, and education. And it goes also for the situation in Afghanistan, where the long-standing discrimination against girls' education still continues today. In terms of what education, which is the focus of Track 2, we can see more and more emphasis being placed on 4 pillars. The what of education, on foundational learning, on skills for life and living together in our full diversity, our skills for a changing world of work, and on education for sustainable development. These pillars need to become more integrated, more context-specific, and much more gender transformative. And there are concrete proposals here to get behind for rapid recovery of learning losses, to support at least 2 years of free preschool education, to advance legislative measures to ensure entitlements to adult learning and education of a lifelong perspective, to integrate climate change into curricula, to revisit the right to education, and to rethink pedagogies of curiosity and cooperation rather than repetition and competition. But here we also see a second tension between a focus on foundational learning and a focus on the full spectrum of educational needs and priorities. We have to find common ground on building blocks of truly transformative education. And I know that those who are strong advocates for foundational learning are well-intentioned, so let's respect the different views here, but for 2 reasons. I feel that this is a false dichotomy. First, I don't believe that there is a choice here. Our world has changed and is changing at a dramatic pace, and education just needs to catch up. This isn't a luxury, it's a right. As the Secretary General said, any country that is not advancing a root and branch overhaul of its entire education system today risks being left behind tomorrow. And this can't be something that is reserved for developed countries alone. It's a global issue. And second, while we need to double down on securing foundational learning for all, we cannot have a one-size-fits-all formula, and it cannot be the only priority. We need to listen closely to what developing countries themselves say that they want. And what I heard from ministers this week is that they want to pursue an education that will support their people, their societies, and their economies. So let us be clear. While the Secretary General does intend to put forward a vision for transforming education in September, the Transforming Education Summit will not decide what a government should prioritize or how a government should sequence its education system's transformation. And nor should that be determined by the international community. What we must do in the international community is to support and accompany that transformation, accompany national authorities in their unique context, working hand in hand with local actors and their societies, with young people, and that can and should make a choice. This perhaps, friends, ladies and gentlemen, is the first step to transformation, is recognizing that roles are reversing. This is about taking ownership. It is about being demand-driven from the grassroots up. Now turning to teachers and teaching. Action Track 3. There is no transformation of education without the transformation of the teaching profession, with teaching moving away from instructor, of the pack to the guide, and facilitator who is supporting autonomous learning. And here again, there are some concrete proposals here. It is clear that we need to empower the teaching workforce with the capacities and tools that they need to help transform. They must have an enabling environment. We need to rethink the professional competencies of transformative teachers. We need to invest in the education workforce to make this happen, including through possible spending benchmarks on our teaching workforce. But while we need to build this enabling environment, we teachers, and in particular their unions, we need them to embrace this journey with an open mind, with a mind that said for every investment, there must be a return. And the return that we are asking for now is in the lives of the learner. In terms of digital learning, we see a convergence around 5 critical areas. Expanding efforts to connect learners as we drive for broader universal connectivity and close the digital divide, including by bringing education to those for whom school is simply not an option. Developing national, regional, and global public digital education platforms and launching a drive for open public digital learning resources as part of the digital commons. Leveraging digitalization to maximize potential of in-person learning, and ensuring that the digital transformation of education is accompanied by a commitment to democratic, participatory governance and the protection of the safety and privacy. And here we've seen enormous abuses online for children in school as we went through the pandemic. Finally, in terms of education financing, we've come a long way, and yes, we're beginning to see the bigger picture. We need to increase the volume and effectiveness of education financing, including from a spending per student perspective, especially in lower and middle income countries. And we need to change the narrative that positions such financing as a simple expenditure rather than the incredible investment that it is in people and in our societies and nation building. We have specific proposals that rightly look at domestic financing of education through the prism of public investments in social goods, education, health, social protection, water and sanitation. These include actions on taxes, that's revenue mobilization, domestic at that, debt servicing, deficit financing, and so much more. They include, of course, efforts on equitable and efficient use of educational investment with adequate accountability data and mechanisms. And crucially, they include important proposals on international financing, including on aid, on the role of the IMF, and the broader multilateral development banks, including what I would hope to see the operationalization of the International Financing Facility for Education, which is an amazing innovation for low and middle income countries. It is simply not credible to insist that developing countries meet their domestic financing benchmarks while international financing to education is falling. The contours of a global compact for education financing are emerging, and I believe that we can land that one in September. In all of this, we also saw some important momentum build around some specific global initiatives. These include initiatives on school meals, on digital learning resources, on learning recovery, and on innovative financing and more. We don't have the time to go into more details, and you've already been really patient with me, but I do encourage partners to get behind these initiatives between now and September. Dear friends and colleagues, let me say another takeaway that is really important is the considerable amount of work that we need to do to move and generate the political commitment to turn these elements into action. In their interventions, governments spoke to many of the above elements. Certainly, there was a focus on how to reach the most vulnerable, leverage digital learning where coding becomes a norm and not just for a few, on gender equality, on foundational learning, on skills for the labor market, and much more. But I also heard quite a bit that was centered on the education system and plan that exists today. When heads of state come to the UN in September, we need them to speak directly to the education system they envisage for the future and the commitments they can make now to try to make this happen, including how they can integrate transformation into their efforts to drive recovery from the pandemic and the impacts of the Ukraine war to accelerate SDG progress by 2030. But we also need their constituencies and the entire education ecosystem to support them when they do so. It's one thing for a president or a minister to want to move a transformation. It's another thing for the bureaucracy to get behind it. I understand that the vast majority of countries are only now beginning their transforming educational national consultations. So now's the opportunity to really engage with the question of transformation when doing so, and engage, as one member of our community said, in a way that people begin to interrogate it, question it, own it, and therefore come to September with clear plans on how to move forward. Please bring with you to September our partners from the young people, the students, civil society, teachers, private sector, and as one member, again, of the member states said to us today, parents who have the greatest investments in children, not only from the resources that they put in out of pocket, but also the decision they take as to whether a child will in fact go to school or not. Count on our resident coordinators, our partners in UNESCO, UNICEF, ILO, ITU, and UNHCR at the country level, and many more to support you in this endeavor, to convene, to facilitate, to enable the ambition happen. My takeaway, third takeaway is how we reimagine the vehicles for change that we have in place at the national and international levels. At the national level, this starts with securing a whole of government approach. If transformation is our objective, then we need finance, labor, health, agriculture, digital transformation, and other sectors to see their responsibilities for driving educational process as well. And we need national institutes, teacher training colleges, and more to be engaged fully with this. We could not do this for this pre-summit because ultimately this can only be done at the country level, and much more has to be done in the coming months. It also applies to securing a whole of society approach. I sensed a degree of frustration this week from our teachers, from our young people, and from our civil society partners. Many saying they really didn't know what was going on with the national consultations. So we need to continue to do not just say the right things about stakeholder inclusion, but that really we need to get on with the actions to help that be changed. As one young person said to our leaders, we do not need to be praised for our resilience, for how far we've come, or how passionate we are to see change that doesn't have our address. We want you to lead, to stand by your words and truly transform education in a way where we are all included. Spoken word by young people. At the international level, we also have work to do. We are fortunate to have some of the most amazing and committed people in the multilateral system who are dedicating their lives to education. But I get a sense that we don't really feel that transforming education means transforming how we work as a collective of education partners in the international constituency. Each of our leading actors, UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, education funds, and more, need to think about whether their business models are what we need to support countries on their journey to economic transformation. Whether we are creating space, finding ways to bring the capacities of our specialized agencies, funds, and programs to bear on the ground. And this is important because mindsets have to change. We have to let go of the past in order to embrace the future and the transformation that is needed. It is not the sole responsibility of the leadership of these organizations, however. It is also the responsibility of our member states, the boards of these organizations, and the donors who support them. The establishment of the high-level steering committee is a really important step forward, and I commend the Director General of UNESCO and the President of Sierra Leone and the committee members, our member states, our stakeholders, for lending their time and commitment to this new arrangement. Let's make it work. As we move beyond the summit, it will be essential that we strengthen our engagement with the committee to deliver on the mandate. Dear friends, excellencies, my final takeaway. It is that all of this deep transformative change simply will not happen without a movement for transformation. If the global public, if students, teachers, parents, young people, civil society, businesses in the private sector, and others do not demand this change, if they do not mobilize for concrete action, then governments are unlikely to give this the priority that it deserves. Remembering that many governments have to make choiceless choices. Is it listening to Greta and the climate action? Or is it giving health and services for those that are recovering from COVID? Or is it education? These are basically choiceless choices. We shouldn't have to make these choices. We should have them all. So this is why I finish with a call for much greater public engagement and for a global movement of transforming education, a movement that acts, that transforms, and that at the center of it is accountability. A movement that can guide behind a new vision for this September and announce itself to the world as bold, as courageous, as loud, young, and expectant. And again, there's a tension here between the structures, the initiatives, and actors that we have today and the reality and the response that we have on the ground. And we can do both. We need our traditional civil society actors to fully mobilize on the ground as they have done over the decades. But we also need to expand the movement, to connect with other movements, with new voices, to give spaces and to engage with new constituencies and to include parents. We need to ignite that movement. but remembering that it cannot be controlled. It must be seeded to grow organically, locally, and globally. This week, I could feel that you see the need to come together. You recognize that we need to focus on the big picture while ensuring it is fed by the small issues, the issues of those people that cannot be heard. So over the coming months, I encourage you to put our heads together to find common ground and the right tactics to ignite a groundswell of support for education transformation. Dear friends, we've come a long way. We've come to the end of a very long week. We have momentum and opportunity. We've done an amazing job together to get this far, but we've still got an enormous amount to do. Over the next 2 months, we will need to move forward together on a number of fronts. We need to sharpen the input from the thematic action tracks as we look to the Secretary General's vision statement for transforming education, which will serve as a key input into the intergovernmental negotiations of the Summit of the Future, which underpins one of the critical elements to our common agenda. We need to support countries as they go back to their capitals and look to deepen the national consultations and expand engagement, as we heard demanded by Doris and Sophia. We need to learn ourselves from what young people told us, that they were pleased to be involved, but they want to be more integrated in the real discussion with world leaders. And we need to work together to ignite that movement in September, grounded in priorities of young people, of students, of parents, of teachers, and of people across the world. It is, after all, lifelong learning. So thank you very much to everyone. As the Secretary General said in his opening, let us aim high. Let us build on the concrete outcomes of this amazing pre-summit, and let's get to work. Thank you.